Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus and the tension of being in the world, but not of it. And my guest today is a brand new friend of mine, Kendra Dahl, who is an author, a mother, a women's ministry director, and has written and shared a bit about her own story involving abortion as a 16-year-old girl. And we have a conversation about that today and her experience in the church, her encouragement to churches, to women and men who are in the midst of this themselves. I was blown away by the conversation. It was so encouraging to me. I know that you're going to find that to be the case for you as well. Let's jump into it. Kendra, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
For all our people who maybe don't know you yet, would you just introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you're doing in life right now?
Yeah, well, my name is Kendra Dahl. I live in the San Diego area with my husband, and we've got 3 kids. We are in the thick of the teenage years, so 12, 14, and 18. We're launching our first senior. And I am a women's ministry director at a local church here, and I wrote my first book this year with Moody Publishers called A Place for You. So life is full. We're busy. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, you have been very open about the reality that abortion is a part of your life story, and I'd love if you just would take some time and share your story with people.
Yeah, I'd love to. I grew up in the church. I went to Awana when I was a kid I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a program. Yeah, you had it too? Okay. Yeah. So memorize all the verses, as a faithful Awana kid. And we moved to the East Coast. I'm originally from North Dakota. So we moved to the East Coast when I was 12 years old. And we started going to pretty fundamentalist church at that time. And that kind of rattled me. I was pretty hurt by my parents through the move, and then in this church where Christianity became, one-to-one with you have to follow the rules or get in line. And started going to a Christian school at that time that was a lot about putting on the good show and don't ask questions. And so through my middle and high school years, I just really struggled with wanting to be loved, wanting to be seen, wanting to be accepted. So I looked for that in the love of immature boys, all the while wrestling with just what is Christianity? Who is Jesus? What does it look like to belong to the church? And kind of got this message of a gospel that is follow the rules. And I was really bad at that. And so it was more like fake it till you make it. And I was not making it. So when I was 16, I got pregnant and had a secret abortion. And then moved. My family moved that summer. And so I just tried to leave that behind, move into my junior year of high school, just kind of plow forward like nothing happened. But of course, it doesn't work that way. So
is it truly a secret from everyone? Did you tell anyone about that?
I had, my boyfriend and a friend from high school, and kind of like these 3 kids trying to figure it out by ourselves. It stayed secret for a while. And I confessed it to my parents my senior year of high school with the help of a youth pastor who kind of helped shepherd me through that. And they were so gracious, and I'm sure we could get more into what that looked like. It was a lot of years of struggle after that, and eventually trying to be a Christian, trying to make up for my sin. And by the time I hit the end of my college years, I left my faith for a few years and ended up pregnant again at 22, had my daughter Hadley. And then, a few years later, found myself sitting in the back of a church, which is a whole nother story, but heard the gospel for what felt like the first time. The pastor said, the gospel doesn't try harder, it's actually try less. And I remember leaning in, kind of mad, because that's not the gospel I had heard my whole life. And that was the first time I started to believe that the grace of God was sufficient for me in Christ, and God began to just really bring a lot of healing and freedom and set my life on a new trajectory. So that was, nearly, or I guess 15 years ago now. But.
Wow. I wonder if you can let us into your world a little bit as a 16-year-old, finding out that you're pregnant. You're at this church that's fundamentalist, and what was your concept of what it meant to be pregnant as a 16-year-old, what it meant to consider an abortion at that time? Was it something that was talked about in your family, in your church, anything like that?
I was pretty much in the midst of like purity culture at that time, right? Where we took the purity vow. We talked about how bad sex was before marriage, and this church in particular was very involved in the pro-life movement. And so we went to the March for Life in DC. We were really only talked about abortion as things that those evil people did that wanted to kill babies, and I was caught up in that. That was what I thought it was, and so it's crazy to me. It's been so crazy as a mom raising daughters and just watching my daughters come to that age of development that I was and think like, you are a child, and how grown up I felt. But when I look back at it, I think I had no understanding of my fertility. I had really no idea what was happening. And yet all I knew was to tell people about this, to bring this in. I could only imagine shame and rejection and just a radical life change that I was unprepared for. And so yeah, there was just this huge clash of values, right? These values that I have been hearing and that I believe to some degree, but also this reality I was facing of, I don't want this. I'm not ready for this. I don't know how life could continue this way. And yeah, so when I think about it, I think that's a really heavy weight for a child, a teenager to try to navigate on her own. And I feel so sad when I look back at that 16-year-old kid, because I think I would have found a lot of support had I reached out, but I really believed a lie that I was alone and that I wouldn't have received it if I had asked for help, Yeah.
And you mentioned it would have been a couple years later that you told your parents?
Yeah.
And they responded with grace. Is that true?
They did. Yeah, that was just one of the sweetest moments. My dad just said, we forgive you. And he was so sad. He said, we're just so sad you carried that by yourself. I still can't talk about that without just wanting to weep because, yeah, I do think my parents have been so faithful in just preaching. My husband and I call it the family gospel, this truth that you belong here, you belong to us, you can always come home. And, that's what I found when I was 22 and found myself pregnant again and I called home. It's just like, you are ours, you belong here, you can always come home. And I know I would have had that welcome at 16, but I didn't believe it at the time.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything to learn as parents even in that? Like, I think I'm a father. My daughter is 7 right now, and I've been in youth ministry for a long time, and so I know better than to believe that like if I do the right things, everything will work out fine. But I also know there are things that we can learn from. Do you think your parents could have done something different that might have helped you see that you could bring them in at that time? Or do you think as a 16-year-old?
Oh, absolutely.
No way. Okay.
There are so many things, right? I think I don't want to speak for your parents. I think my parents, but that generation of parenting was a lot of like, don't ask, don't tell, kind of, we don't want to know. And even when I think about the youth group and the way that sex and purity was talked about, it was kind of this like, don't do this. But there was no framework for talking about if you're struggling, if you're questioning, if you have fallen, if you're caught up in something you don't want to be caught up in. And so there was just not this openness that I felt to be able to say like, I did have sex. What do I do now? How do I handle this? It's kind of like the only framework is don't. So what if you do? Then what? And I think that's probably where cultivating this openness that's like we're trying to form a conscience, right? We're trying to help our children believe that God's way is good for them, that's where life is found, and that we want them to desire obedience, not because it's restrictive, but because this is the good and right path. Yeah. But we also want to cultivate the welcome that says, you've heard that analogy, right? I've messed up, don't tell my dad, or I've messed up, I need to call my dad, right? And I think that feeling of I messed up, I need to call my dad is really the idea that as a parent, that I want to try to cultivate with my kids. And I think even in a youth ministry to have that posture that says, here's the ideal, but when you fall, because you will, this is what it looks like to find grace and to walk back towards restoration.
You said there was a youth pastor who helped you confess this to your parents. That was not at the fundamentalist church. It was at a different church.
Right. Yeah. When we moved my junior year of high school, I was in a little bit of a healthier church and a really supportive youth group that kind of, that I plugged into and really was life for me in those couple of years. And that's where I found some freedom to start to bring other people in.
So tell me about that. What was happening in that youth group? What was happening at that church with that pastor in particular that created the environment where that could happen?
That's a good question. It's funny. It's things you don't think about what the factors were. I think part of it was just a sense of belonging. I got plugged in to a youth group that really had a heart to see kids get connected, and I joined the youth group band, and so I kind of found my people and had some friends, and I felt such a dissonance where here was this huge part of my story that I am struggling with, and then here are these people that I'm trying to let them get to know me, and there was just this wall, and I just, like I said, desperately wanted to be known, and so there's a part of it that is probably unhealthy, and it lasted for a while where I became this compulsive confessor, and that's kind of where it started, where it was like, you can't really know me unless you know all the dark parts of my story. But I think it really was driven by this desire to be known and being in an environment where it's like, maybe you're safe to be known by. And I think part of that was just an environment that was genuinely loving and where I felt like I could be more honest. I mean, I remember one of the there were a couple of youth pastors, and one of them talking about sexual purity and going up to him and saying, I think you need to talk about this with, I mean, I'm sure I didn't say more nuance. I wasn't that mature, but to say like, what about people who messed up? Like, you didn't talk about them, and something about that environment made me feel like I could share that with him. And I never would have done that in the previous church, Yeah. So, but it's hard to put my finger on what that was. There's something just about maybe a better understanding of who Jesus was, but yeah, definitely a sense of belonging there.
You're deeply involved in the church world today. You're a women's ministry director, and you've been willing to share this so that people know your story. And I would imagine that you've experienced a lot of different reactions in the church to talking about this. And I wonder if you could just share, if you're willing, some of the good and some of the ugly of what it's been like to just be open and honest about your story inside the church.
Yeah, well, what's mostly encouraging is that it's mostly been good, right? People have received my story with a lot of grace, and I think I've helped people move towards compassion when they think about this issue, because they realize, oh, like, you're a person, right?
Yeah.
It's really easy for when we think about this issue, to think about the people out there, the evil people who do these wicked things, and not think about the 16-year-old girl who really just doesn't believe she has another choice. And so I've just, met profound grace in people who have received my story. The most common response, and maybe most common isn't the right, but in every situation where I've shared my story, at least one woman has come up to me and disclosed her own abortion story. And oftentimes I'm the first person she's told. And that is remarkable to me. And that's something that I like to share with pastors, because I think we don't realize these women are in our midst, they're in our churches, they're in our congregations, and they're holding this as a secret because it just doesn't feel safe to share. And so every time I publish an article, every time I share my story, I get an email, I get a call, somebody walks up to me, and people are just desperate to share with someone that they feel like it would be safe to share with. And I am a stranger, but because I share their story, it feels safer to share with me than the people who are close to them in their lives. And I think that's really a shame. Some of the negative responses, I think the biggest thing, I think the most negative response I've gotten is really just people who want me to move towards a political response on this issue. They want me to become a staunch pro-life advocate and become, the spokesperson for the, political advocacy in this movement. And I understand, we like a good poster child, right, for our movements. And I don't think that's my calling. But I also think it's because there's this discomfort when we approach this issue from a place of compassion. Some people get a little uncomfortable because they're saying, wait, are you pro-life? Like, you're pro-life, right? You're not saying abortion's okay. And there's this wanting to call me on the carpet and be clear. You're being clear, right? You're saying abortion is wrong. And yes, I am. I do believe life begins at conception, and I believe that abortion is devastating to women. It's not just that it is the loss of a human life, but also it is the devastation to a human soul. And I think that that's absolutely something that we need to reckon with, but I don't think that the political stage is where that needs to happen. And I think a lot of people would rather see me arguing there than trying to care for individual people who have been hurt by this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think many churches, maybe most, I'm not sure, have fallen into a little bit of that political trap of primarily treating abortion as a political issue. And it makes it, compassion just is not an aspect of our political conversations today.
Sadly, no, yes.
It's black and white, it's good people and bad people. And even if you're advocating for something good politically, if that's the context in which you have this conversation, it's impossible not to alienate and other people in your own congregation, guests, visitors, any of that.
Right.
Have you seen the church handle this well? What have you seen that you would say, like, yes, I would love to see churches doing this, talking about this way? What have you seen that's encouraged you?
Yeah, I think the best way to talk about this is always the both and, right? It's kind of like when I was talking about the youth group. It's like we talk about sexual purity, we talk about God's good plan, and we talk about what happens when you fall. We talk about what happens when you're grappling with the consequences of struggling, of shame. And I feel like the same thing is true here. We talk about the issue. What is true? We help people build a pro-life ethic that's built upon scripture. Because I think that, there are a lot of cultural lies that are trying to dehumanize across the board, right? We're trying to pick away at the image of God. And I think we need to help build that up especially for this next generation, that they would have a biblical pro-life ethic. And I think that's really important. And at the same time, we need to know that as we do that, there are women who are sinking lower in the seat, wishing that they could disappear, thinking maybe everybody can see through them and knows that part of their story. And so where I've seen this done well is for someone to be able to speak the truth and to say, but if you are here and this is part of your story, God sees you and he loves you, and you are not a second-class citizen in this church. And I've even just been so personally cared for by pastors who know this part of my story and who speak about abortion from the pulpit and then text me or call me after the service to say, are you okay? How was that? Is there a way that I could have spoken with more compassion? Help me grow in this. And I think just that posture of wanting to care well for people who are struggling, who, sometimes I've gone through, it's been so many years since my abortion and so much therapy, and I feel like I'm in just such a healthy place. And then every once in a while, there'll be a conversation where I will feel nauseous or just feel like I want to just check out because this is just too hard. And that's wild to me to imagine, like, this many years later, something like that could be so triggering. And so just to think about how this is something that some people will struggle with in some way for the rest of their lives. And so to be able to have that in your mind, that whenever you talk about this, for some people, this is not just an issue out there that you're talking about. This is a very personal thing that they've experienced and a very deep wound. And you need to handle that with care.
There are going to be many people listening to this who don't know it right now, but who will find themselves in a similar position at some point, as you did as a 16-year-old, who will have an unwanted pregnancy, who maybe will be a man who is in a relationship with a woman who has an unwanted pregnancy. What would you say to those people who find themselves in that situation that you wish you would have heard from someone as a 16-year-old when you were in that same spot?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't have wanted to hear, like, it's not going to be as bad as you think. It would have been as bad as I thought, right? Being pregnant, having a baby at 16 would have been devastating. It would have changed everything about my life. And so I think trying to downplay the reality of what having a child would look like is unhelpful.
We do
So
that a
I
little bit,
think
don't we? I mean,
we do. You'd be like, you can do this. It'll be great. It's like,
and
actually, I mean, even at 22 to have a baby, I felt like I was at a different stage of my life and I knew how awful abortion was. And so that put me in a different place to consider, having a baby at that point. But even still, it was not just a walk in the park, you know? So I think that's one thing is honesty. I think what we need is honesty. So it's the honesty alongside you don't have to do this alone. And let's walk together through whatever is next. Let's just take it one day at a time, and I'm going to be with you. We're going to be in this together. And I know that sounds maybe a little trite, but I think that's the biggest thing is the fear is being alone. The fear is, how am I going to do this? The fear is that the impact on my life is going to be too devastating to be able to handle. So I don't know. I think that's part of it is somebody being able to say, this is it's going to be as hard as you think. You won't have to do it alone. And I still do have hope for you on the other side of this, that there will be good, that we are going to be able to walk through this together. And I do say that ultimately knowing that human life, human life is a gift from the Lord. I think about my daughter Hadley is such a means of God's grace to me. And we don't know whether someone chooses to make an adoption plan for their baby or whether somebody chooses to raise their child in whatever path they choose. We know that there is blessing found in obedience, and that the Lord does good. He is good and he does good. And so I know all of those platitudes might not be right to hear. And that's why I say you can't bring on the platitudes alongside like, oh, it's going to be fine. We gotta tell the truth about what will be hard. And we gotta get in the weeds about what help will look like, and how we're going to walk alongside people. But I think that presence matters, and being a voice of hope when despair feels like the only option, I think is essential.
yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that, as that 16-year-old girl, you just really didn't feel like there was another option. And I wonder, were you surprised at all what it was like having had an abortion? Your view of what it meant to choose abortion and your ability to move past that, or what it would mean for your life. Was it different than what you expected it to be? Did it? Did you regret that decision immediately? Was it years later? What was it? What was it like going through that maybe you couldn't have foreseen as a 16-year-old?
Yeah, regret is always a hard topic for me because I think if I were to be really honest, I didn't regret it immediately because I was a teenager and I didn't want to have a baby, but yet I did regret it in the sense that I was scared. I bled heavily for weeks and nobody knew that, like, there was nobody I could talk to. And I was really scared, like maybe I had done something to my body, maybe something was wrong. And just kind of always had that fear that something was broken, and just felt a lot of shame and fear. And even just that became kind of an ongoing issue for me, just around bleeding, and just being kind of fearful and triggered by that. And so it was this mix of like, I regretted it for the emotional toll, for the shame, for the effect it had on my body, for the just the way that it affected how I thought about myself, about how it affected my approach to God. And yet when it comes to my life, it was kind of this like, I just plow forward. That was the right thing. I went to cheerleading camp the next week. I just need to move forward because that's what life needs to look like. And so it's just always hard to know how to think about it. I think being able to see and name clearly what it was and how it was a sin against a holy God, I feel like that came a lot later. And even being able to look back at that with regret it's just I don't know, it's a difficult thing to name when when you look back on your life and think, I wish I would have done things differently. And also like, I'm so grateful for the Lord's grace and how he's used it to shape me and draw me to himself. So I don't know. I don't know that that answered your question. I'm sorry.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, if you're willing, I'd love you to tell me more about just that journey of getting to a point of being able to receive God's grace in that. What what did you have to hear? What did the Spirit have to do in your heart to be able to accept that?
Yeah, I think what I didn't realize after my abortion, and I think this is true before, is that I was working really hard to prove that I was good enough. I believed that Christianity was like, show that you're good enough. And then I like committed the unpardonable sin, and then I really had a lot to make up for. And I thought that the way that I could do that was like being the really good Christian school kid, or I mean, the really good Christian kid. And even my senior year of high school, I was like, I'm not going to kiss another boy until my wedding day. I'm like going to be the poster child for purity culture. And I went to college and I'm like, I'm going to join a sorority and win them all for Jesus. And, I'm just like, I'm going to be the best Christian that's out there. And actually, I wasn't going to join a sorority and win them all for Jesus. I was going to join a sorority and realize I had so much shame and I was so tired from trying to live up to all of it that I was going to just decide to like give in to sex and alcohol because that's like way easier than trying to prove you're good enough. And so I think by the time, I was in the thick of college, it was just I had given up on trying. To me, God was just this angry taskmaster, this dad, always disappointed, and I was sick of feeling like a failure. And so when it comes to receiving his grace, I mentioned hearing the gospel isn't try harder, it's try less. I think that rattled me so much because it really confronted and like right in my face, like you can't do anything to make up for the sin of your past. You bring nothing into this relationship. That God's grace is that he does all of it, and I went and started reading Romans. Why Romans? It's funny how the Lord works. It's like my Awana kicked in, and it's like there's those verses, and I just really saw myself in chapter 1 where it talks about those people who exchange the truth about God for lies, and that I wasn't really willing to just call my sin and say, I can't do anything about this. Like, I'm desperate for mercy. All I can do is cast myself upon God and say, be merciful to me, a sinner. And I feel like it's that breaking point of being like, I can't pay for this, where I truly experienced God's grace is coming to the end of myself. But even that, it's not like it was quick, right? Because we're so well practiced in trying to be good enough. And so it's like I came back into the church and I was growing as a disciple and just hungry and eager. And I felt like I do believe that's when the Lord gave me a new heart and I really began to truly grow in my faith and it stuck, I met my husband, we got married very quickly, and I felt like we needed to have a lot of children. That was, even though I never really wanted kids, it was just like, well, that's what good Christian women do. We have lots of babies and we better get started. And so we had we got pregnant right away, and then I had a miscarriage. And that miscarriage was really what I think that was kind of the confrontation between God and I, because it felt like punishment. And it wasn't. I want to say that really clearly for anyone who would be listening, because I think this is a lie a lot of post-abortive women feel, is that God will punish them for the sins of their past through their fertility in some way. And I think that's a lie from the pit of hell, that God does not require payment for our sins that Christ paid for. When we put our faith in Christ, he paid for our sin in full. But I believed that for a moment, right, that this was something that I deserved. And I look back at that with such gratitude for that experience, because it really made me wrestle with like, what is atonement really? can I really, does this miscarriage, does that really pay for it? Is that it? Would that be sufficient? One life for another? Is that really it? And even it made me look back at Hadley's life, my oldest daughter, to say, did I think by having this baby that made up for it? What am I doing here? What do I think I'm going to earn? What do I think I'm going to prove? And I think that's when it really finally clicked that there's just really nothing I can do to make up for this, that unless it's got to be Jesus or it's nothing. So I think that's something that we all have, these self-salvation projects, but I think especially for post-abortive women, and especially when it comes around mothering and our children, I think that can get really twisted, where we think we got to do something to make up for it. And it definitely has been something I had to struggle through.
That's so good. I wonder if, before we go, if you would just say a word to those listening who, men and women who have abortion as a part of their story, who are in the church and kind of, as you described, this has been a secret. It's not been something they have felt like they could share. It's been something that they believe would completely change the way their friends, the people in their church would look at them, their pastor, and who still carry just a lot of shame around that. What would you say to those folks?
Yeah, I think there are two things I would want to, two different trains of thoughts. I'll try to say them quickly. One is, I love the Heidelberg Catechism. If you're familiar with this, ancient catechism that summarizes the Christian faith, and the question number 60. Say, go Google it. Heidelberg Catechism, question and answer 60. It says, how are you justified before God? It says, only by true faith in Jesus Christ. Even though my conscience accuses me of having grievously sinned against all God's commands, of having never kept any of them, nevertheless, out of sheer grace, God grants to me the perfect satisfaction and righteousness of Christ. I butchered it, but it's something like that. And I remember a woman who disclosed her abortion to me, and I read that to her, and she took it from my hands and needed to read it again for herself. I think that when we are trapped in shame, we need to come back again and again to that doctrine of justification. That how are you righteous before God? Only by true faith in Jesus Christ. And that doesn't mean our consciences won't continue to accuse us. But when you go to Romans 8 and it says, who can condemn you? It's only God who can condemn you. And he doesn't condemn you because Jesus took our condemnation upon himself. And that reality frees us to be transparent before others who might think that they can condemn us, and we might not get the responses that we desire. But ultimately, we rest in the satisfaction and righteousness of Christ. And what I have found over and over again is that people who have heard my story have received it with grace. And I think that it's a lie from Satan that people will condemn us. And that's because he wants to keep us in darkness. And yet, as we walk in the light, I think we'll truly experience freedom. And the other thing is to go to Luke 7 and to see the way God interacts with the sinful woman. I just love that passage because the point in that story is to show that the Pharisee actually is not less sinful than the sinful woman, right? That's actually the point. It's this contrast between this woman who's a sinner. She's a big sinner, and everybody knows she's a sinner. And she's so full of shame, all she can do is crawl to Jesus' feet. And the Pharisees are condemning her and looking at her and talking about what a great sinner she is. And then Jesus tells this parable, and he says, he's comparing them. Who's got the greater debt and has been forgiven? And then who will love the master more? The one who's been forgiven the greater debt, right? And so his point in telling the story is to help the Pharisee see, you think this woman has a greater debt than you, but actually your debt is great, but you don't even see it. And yet, in the process, he shows how much this woman has been forgiven, and that as a result of having been forgiven much, she can love him much. Yeah. And that's why I think I wouldn't trade my story for anything, because I know the depths of God's mercy in a way that I know some people are blind to because they don't realize what sinners they are. And so I know it's really hard to be able to look at the hard parts of our story and praise God for them. I mean, that seems crazy, right? But I think about the Apostle Paul saying, I received mercy so that I could be an example of God's perfect patience and love and mercy. And I think that if we see ourselves as those who have been forgiven a great debt, then the only response that we have is to be those who love our master. And I don't know, I'm grateful to be able to have that story so that I understand mercy in a way that I can share with others. And I think that I hope that would encourage others as well.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you. Kendra, I've so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for the time. Thank you for your honesty and your encouragement.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
Thanks. Well, once again, that was Kendra Dahl. And if you are interested in hearing more from her, not only on this topic, but on many others as well, you can find all of her work at kendradahl.com, and we'll put that in the show notes. I hope this was helpful for you as you think about how the church can think about topics of human life and abortion, how we can be not just people who talk about what's true, but people who show the grace of Jesus, knowing especially that we need it as much as anyone else. So I hope you're encouraged, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time on Native Exiles.